Breaking the Harbou spell and capitalist realism. Reflecting on Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. I've been in the United States for almost 6 years now. I've spent most of it in New York City and Washington, D.C. Living here after growing up witnessing the slow motion collapse of Lebanon gave me a very specific kind of peripheral vision. I see the gears of the system grinding everywhere, and what scares me is that capitalism has become so dominant that we literally cannot imagine an alternative. That's exactly the premise of Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, which I read recently. This week's newsletter is going to be delving into some of his ideas and how I witnessed or experienced them in my new life and the old one. The entrepreneurs and the Harbous. A big part of my career has been fighting against the Free Patriotic Movement, or the Aounists. After a brief moment in my teenage years when I was mesmerized by their progressive Orange Plan in the 2005 elections, I quickly got disenchanted when Michel Aoun sold his soul to Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah in 2006, right after the first elections following the end of the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, 5 years after the Israeli occupation had ended. Many in the anti-Syrian occupation camp allied themselves with Hezbollah and other Syrian occupation collaborators. As someone who went down to protest on March 14, 2005, with my family and even my beloved late dog Titan, it felt like a betrayal. Only days before, Hezbollah and other Syrian assets had staged their own protest to, quote-unquote, thank the Assad regime for 29 years of brutal, humiliating occupation rivaled only by Israel's. The Aounists were the only ones who hadn't allied themselves with Hezbollah, and I was excited about them. I was born after Michel Aoun ran away to France and abandoned his supporters and family, who were subsequently crushed by the Assad regime. So I didn't know enough about the man's failures and damage. To me, he was just the only one who seemed to not have betrayed what had motivated an entire population on March 14, 2005, when enough pressure was built to eject the foreign army whose checkpoint I had to pass every single Sunday on the way to my hometown in Ehden. On February 6, 2006, the Manamkhayl Maronite wedding between Aoun and Nasrallah took place. Not even a year after the election in which Aoun had run against the so-called elite sectarian parties aligned with Hezbollah. Those elites, mind-bogglingly, including Saad al-Hariri, whose father had been assassinated by Hezbollah and Assad months before he capitulated to Hezbollah and effectively anointed them as the successor to the security state that the Syrian occupation had left behind. That assassination was the moment the regime had clearly crossed the line and pushed so many of us into the streets. Not out of personal devotion for Hariri, but because the car bomb cannot be the way our lives are governed. That betrayal by what was called March 14, followed by the betrayal of the Free Patriotic Movement, cemented my political beliefs. I realized none of what was on offer represented me, not even remotely, and I knew I wasn't the only one. Looking back, these were all small steps on the road to October 17, 2019. But I digress. When the FBN got into power on Hezbollah's back, they proved to be just as bad, if not worse, than the rest. It became painfully clear how blatantly corrupt, incompetent, and most importantly, cruel they were. One of my relatives, who I am no longer in contact with, remained a die-hard Aounist. Even when I was being illegally detained by them, she still supported the disgraced and the reviled Gibran Bassil. In one heated conversation, she let the mask slip, and I finally understood the mindset behind supporting someone who had demonstrably made all of our lives worse. She said something along the lines of, Birri and Jublat and Hariri have been stealing for decades. Now it's our turn. The statement was problematic on so many levels. The most obvious was the sectarian angle. Christians in Lebanon were largely left out of the post-Civil War spoils. After being the pre-war elites, the resentment never really subsided. You can see it in the obsession with Bashir Jmail to this day, and the quote-unquote if-only refrain that many right-wing Christians use to explain why the country is helpless and unreformable. Because of that one assassination, among so many in a really brutal war. To her, the naked corruption of the Aounists was payback, or at least finally getting a piece of the cake after years of operating in the shadows of the Syrian occupation and its local collaborators. Electricity was coming on for fewer hours. The country was collapsing, yet she was happy that Gibran Bassil could buy tailored suits now and shoes with lifted soles, even as her life savings vanished from the bank. It's a zero-sum mindset I keep seeing both in Lebanon and the United States. When a once privileged group feels that a once oppressed group is doing better, is a threat to them instead of something that could make society better for everyone. Then the word Harbou popped into my head and started flashing. It's a Levantine Arabic term used in Lebanon and Syria to describe someone exceptionally clever, sharp-witted, and street-smart. It often carries the sense of someone mischievous or sneaky, always one step ahead, blending intelligence but with a sly edge. Looking back, it connects closely to the Mat'isha idea I wrote about last year, a problematic idea in our society where the slyness and shamelessness of ripping people off is framed as a positive trait. even an admirable one. That's when you realize how deeply naked and unchecked capitalism dominates our psyches, to the point that someone who can extract capital from a captive population and then flaunt the wealth hoarded from other people's labor is seen as something aspirational. It's not that different from the United States' obsession with billionaires, who spend fortunes on building bunkers for an apocalypse they believe is coming, instead of using even a fraction of that wealth to address the very conditions that make them feel the need for private islands and underground shelters when late-stage capitalism finally buckles. The relative couldn't even imagine a world where Basil might have actually done something in the public interest instead of building his entire identity around protecting the sect's rights, حماية حقوق الطائفة, when in reality it was only his offshore bank accounts getting protection. Meanwhile, his Taifa declined even further under his father-in-law's presidency, just like every other Taifa except for the tiny circle of elites from each sect who continued to thrive. It was the worst blend of capitalism and feudalism, the Zaims and their peasants, repackaged as a sect survival while the country hollowed out around them. Seen through Mark Fisher's lens, what we were living was not just corruption or sectarianism, but a failure of imagination carefully cultivated over decades. Capitalist realism shrinks the political horizon until extraction feels inevitable. The harbu becomes aspirational, the zaim becomes unavoidable, and the idea of public good starts to sound like a children's fantasy. When people say, at least it's our turn now, they are not defending obvious theft as much as admitting they cannot picture a system that doesn't revolve around it. Even after decades of blaming Israel and Syria as the reason nothing works and why we can't have nice things, the Aounists and the rest of the sectarian elite never dared to deviate from that exploitative occupier mindset. They kept it exactly the same, just without the occupation excuse to soften the blow anymore. That is the real damage. Not just our stolen money or crumbled institutions, but a collective surrender to the idea that this is the only way things can function. And once that belief has settled in, decline stopped feeling like a policy choice or something that can change, but instead like it's a fate we're all doomed to. My conclusion is, but if capitalist realism is a failure of imagination, then resistance has to begin there too. Mark Fisher didn't argue that capitalism is literally unbeatable. He argued that it convinces us it is. The spell works by narrowing what feels possible. So breaking it does not start with some grand utopian blueprint. It starts with rejecting the zero-sum lie. Rejecting the idea that politics is just organized theft. Rejecting the idea that public good is childish. In Lebanon, that means refusing to see the state as a carcass to be divided among the taifas, and instead as something that can actually function for everyone. It means building and supporting networks that already operate outside the Zaim logic. Mutual aid, independent unions, civic coalitions, cross-sectarian movements like October 17 that briefly cracked the illusion and showed people that they were not alone. It means insisting that electricity, water, banking, justice are not sectarian spoils, but baseline rights for everyone. In New York City and across the United States, it means refusing the billionaire bunker fantasy. It means pushing back against the idea that housing, healthcare, and education are luxuries in the richest city in the world. It means organizing tenants, strengthening labor, supporting public institutions, and making solidarity feel more practical than hoarding. The same imagination that tells Lebanese voter, at least it's our turn, tells an American worker, that's just how the market works. Both can be unlearned. Fisher wrote about cracks in capitalist realism. Moments when the inevitability flickers and something else becomes thinkable. We've seen those cracks in the streets of Beirut in 2019, and union drives across the US, in communities that shows cooperation over competition, even when the system rewards the opposite. During Zohran Mamdani's historic campaign, defeating the Republicans, democratic establishment, and the billionaires and Zionists, by listening to people, then talking to them honestly and working with them on creating a platform instead of letting DC think tanks and consultants do that work and then use comms people to try to sell it to the voters with doublespeak and PR. The point is not naive optimism, it is disciplined imagination. To insist that decline is not destiny, that corruption is not culture, that sectarianism is not nature, that capitalism, especially in its most predatory form, is not gravity. And if the sickness was believing that there is no alternative, then the cure begins by acting as if there is. Not abstractly, but locally, in how we vote, in how we organize, in who we platform, and what we normalize, in how we refuse to admire the harbu and instead admire the person who built something durable and shared. That is how you break the spell, not by waiting for the system to collapse, but by practicing. In Lebanon, New York, and beyond, the world you want to make is possible. It'll never happen if we don't work for it, whether it's in our homes, at the office, school, or community at large.